Have you ever wondered why, even working hard, paying your bills on time, and avoiding excesses, you simply never have enough money? Because that's an uncomfortable, almost offensive question for those who have always believed that effort and responsibility would be enough. The straightforward truth, and few people like to hear this, is that doing everything right doesn't guarantee financial progress. And if that sounds strange or even unfair, stick with me, because this is exactly where the IOE game starts to change. Perhaps you recognize yourself in this phrase. I work, I earn my salary, I don't do crazy things, I'm not in debt, I don't spend on absurd things, so why am I still struggling? This silent feeling accompanies many people. It appears at the end of the month, when the balance is low again, or when a simple unforeseen event turns into a huge problem. And the most curious thing is that most of the time, the person can't point to a clear mistake. There wasn't a catastrophic decision, there wasn't an obvious financial setback. Still, something doesn't add up. Almost no one realizes this point, but the discomfort doesn't stem from a lack of control. On the contrary, it comes from the feeling of doing everything you've been told to do and still not making any progress. This corrodes you from the inside, because when effort doesn't translate into advancement, the automatic conclusion is, the problem must be with me. But this seems normal, but it isn't. The problem is rarely a lack of discipline, a lack of intelligence, or a lack of work. Often, it's hidden in decisions so common that they go unnoticed. In personal finance, there's a dangerous trap in the idea of automatic merit. The belief that working hard, being responsible, and following the standard script guarantees stability and growth. This belief is comfortable because it gives a sense of justice, but it's also incomplete. And that's where frustration arises. You do your part, but the results don't appear. The money comes in, you fulfill obligations, it disappears, and the cycle begins again. If you've been through this, you know the weight this repetition brings. What is almost never discussed is that money doesn't magically disappear, nor because you're disorganized. It disappears because certain normal decisions, those that everyone treats as inevitable, create a kind of silent financial blockage. It's not something glaring, not an obvious mistake. It's a pattern, a financial behavior that seems safe, responsible, and even commendable, but that gradually limits your options, compresses your margin, and robs you of your sense of progress. Perhaps the most disconcerting thing is realizing that earning more doesn't always solve the problem. Many people increase their income and still feel trapped. This is even more confusing because it reinforces the idea that the problem isn't money itself, but how it fits into their lives. The psychology of money comes into play precisely here, when behavior, habits, and decisions speak louder than the number on the paycheck. What you're about to discover might surprise you because it doesn't start with radical cuts or miracle formulas. It starts with an honest look at what seems too normal to question, but which may be costing you much more than you imagine. Because when we start to approach these decisions more honestly, something changes inside. It's not an immediate shock. It's more like a restlessness, a feeling of, wait a minute. Maybe this explains a lot of things. And this realization is usually accompanied by specific memories. That month when the money disappeared without you understanding how. That choice that seemed logical at the time. That routine that everyone said was normal. If any of these images crossed your mind now, it's because this conversation isn't abstract. It touches on real experiences, lived in everyday life. Many people go through this in silence, thinking it's an individual problem, almost a personal failing. But when you start talking about it, you realize you're not alone. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, or when you recognized yourself in it. Sometimes, putting it into words brings more clarity than keeping it all to yourself. And when someone reads a comment like this and realizes they're going through the same thing, the conversation gains momentum. If at any point you thought, that's exactly what happens to me, liking the video is a simple way to reinforce that this type of reflection needs to continue appearing. This helps the content reach more people who are stuck in the same cycle, trying to understand why they do everything right and yet feel blocked. And if you feel that this type of conversation is different from what you usually see out there, subscribing to the channel is a way of saying that you want to continue exploring this topic in more depth, without ready-made formulas and empty promises. The idea here is not to point fingers or sell magic solutions, but to keep this space alive where we can calmly look at decisions that no one questions. Because it is precisely when these normal choices cease to be invisible that understanding begins to reorganize itself. And from there, other questions inevitably arise. When we talk about money disappearing, the first reaction is usually to look for a big, almost dramatic mistake. A bad choice, out of control debt, an absurd expense. But most of the time, that never happened. And that's precisely where the confusion lies. The problem is rarely one big wrong decision. It builds up little by little, in decisions that are too normal to raise suspicion, decisions that everyone makes, that no one questions, that are part of what we call ordinary life. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is one of the hardest hidden truths to accept. Money doesn't disappear all at once, it's drained. Away in small amounts, through seemingly reasonable commitments, through choices that appear responsible in the short term. A little here, a little there. A small comfort that becomes routine. An emotional reward after a tiring month. None of this sounds dangerous in isolation. On the contrary, it even seems deserved. The problem is the accumulated impact of these decisions over time. Almost no one notices this behind-the-scenes aspect of their own financial life. Because when a choice becomes the norm, it ceases to be analyzed. It becomes automatic. You don't wake up thinking, today I'm going to jeopardize my financial future. You wake up trying to make the present easier, to make the day more comfortable, reduce immediate stress, feel that the effort was worthwhile. And this makes perfect sense from an emotional point of view. The blind spot appears when this immediate relief begins to silently compete with building a future for tomorrow. This is where the journey gets interesting. Because the money isn't disappearing due to disorganization or irresponsibility. It's being channeled by a mindset that prioritizes normalcy, doing what everyone else does, living in a way that seems acceptable, going with the flow without questioning too much. But this flow has a cost, and the cost isn't just financial, it's psychological. It's the constant feeling of running, but never truly making progress. When you start to observe these decisions more closely, you realize that the problem isn't isolated. It's structural. It's not a bad month, it's a lifestyle. It's not an isolated choice. It's a series of small decisions that reinforce each other. Each one seems harmless, but together they create an almost invisible blockage. A system where money comes in with a predetermined destination, where there's little room for conscious choices, where any attempt at change seems to require an enormous effort. This is a delicate point because it touches on identity, questioning. Normal decisions is uncomfortable. It gives the feeling of going against common sense, against what has always been said to be the safe path. But that's exactly where the transformation begins. Not with radical cuts or extreme attitudes, but with awareness, with the courage to look at what seems normal and ask, is this really taking me where I want to go? This kind of revelation doesn't happen all at once. It forms gradually as you connect the dots, notice patterns, and understand the silent impact of immediate comfort on the future. And the more clarity emerges, the harder it becomes to ignore certain choices that previously went unnoticed. If at any point in this reflection you felt an inner click, as if something was finally being named, comment below. That makes sense to me. Because it is from this recognition that the conversation begins to gain another depth. There's a point in this conversation where perception shifts, because you begin to understand that the problem isn't exactly the money itself. It's not just how much comes in or how much goes out. It's the space between one thing and another. It's the margin. And almost no one talks about this clearly. You don't lose money first, you lose margin. And when that happens, everything else follows. Margin is what gives you breathing room. It's the space to think before deciding, to absorb an unforeseen event without panic, to say no when something doesn't make sense. When there's a margin, money works in your favor, even without you realizing it. When there isn't, any small variation becomes a huge impact. An unexpected expense becomes a crisis. An opportunity becomes anxiety. A simple decision becomes a disproportionate mental burden. And the most dangerous thing is that this loss of margin happens silently. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is a revelation that completely changes how you view your own financial journey. Most people believe they are financially stable because they can pay their bills. But paying the bills doesn't mean having a financial cushion. Often it means the exact opposite. It means that all the money already has a destination before it even arrives. It comes in, fulfills commitments, and disappears. And in this process, what disappears is not just the balance, but the freedom of choice. Normal decisions compress the future precisely because they gradually consume margin, long installments, increasing fixed costs, living standards that automatically adjust to income. None of this seems wrong in isolation. The problem is the accumulated effect. When you realize it, you're already living in a tight system where everything depends on everything going right all the time. There's no room for error, no pause, no change of course. This generates a specific type of tension that many people feel but can't explain. This is the psychological backdrop that almost no one sees. When there's no room for maneuver, the brain goes into defensive mode. You start making decisions to avoid immediate pain, not to build something bigger. The impact of this goes beyond money. It affects your mindset, your relationship with risk, your ability to plan. You begin to confuse security with immobility. And the longer you stay like this, the harder it seems to get out of that place, even without knowing exactly why. That's why two people with the same income can live completely different realities. One has leeway, the other doesn't. One can absorb changes, the other lives reacting. And this has nothing to do with intelligence or effort, but with structure. When the financial structure doesn't leave room for change, it transforms any unforeseen event into a threat. And living like that for a long time is exhausting. It's tiring. It makes you feel like you're always owing something to the future. When this hidden truth begins to become clear, something internally reorganizes itself. You realize it's not a lack of control. It's overcommitment. It's not negligence, it's complacency. And this understanding shifts the focus from blame to awareness. From then on, certain decisions begin to be seen through a different lens, not as right or wrong, but as something that expands or reduces margins. And this change of perspective opens space for deeper questions, which naturally lead to another level of this conversation. If at any point you've realized that what you lack most today isn't money, but space to breathe and make decisions calmly, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Because recognizing the loss of margin is the first step to seeing what's really at stake. There's a silent injustice that almost no one likes to face because it touches on something very deep. The idea that being responsible should be enough. You do what's expected, meet deadlines, pay bills, avoid excesses, and stay organized. Yet, you look around and see people who seem less careful moving forward faster. This bothers you. And often the automatic reaction is to blame yourself silently or conclude that the world isn't fair. But that explanation is too superficial for what's really happening. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's an important shift in perspective here. Responsibility, on its own, doesn't guarantee progress. In some cases, it even hinders progress. When responsibility becomes merely fulfilling obligations, without a strategy behind it, it can turn into well-intentioned stagnation. You do everything right within a system that wasn't designed to give you leeway, time, or freedom of decision. What seems like progress in other people is often neither boldness nor luck. It's structure. It's someone who protected their financial reserves early on, who preserved time, who didn't tie all their income to fixed commitments. Meanwhile, many responsible people build an extremely efficient life to sustain a tight budget. It works, but it doesn't grow. It maintains itself, but it doesn't advance. And this generates a strange feeling of constant exhaustion, as if all the effort were used only to maintain the status quo. This is a hidden truth that changes the way we interpret reality. The system doesn't only reward those who follow the rules, it favors those who understand how the game works behind the scenes. Those who protect their room for maneuver can make decisions calmly. Those who have time can wait. Those who have leeway choose better, but those who live on. The edge need to decide quickly, accept worse conditions, and prioritize the short term. Not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of space. That's why comparison hurts so much. Because you look and think, I did everything right. And you did. But you did it right within a logic that values stability, not progress. The frustration begins to transform into clarity when you realize that the problem isn't character, nor effort. It's design. It's mindset applied to decisions. It's understanding. That responsibility without strategic vision becomes mere maintenance. When this realization begins to sink in, something changes internally. Guilt loses its power and gives way to awareness. You begin to see that moving forward isn't about working harder or being even more rigid with yourself. It's about creating conditions to make better choices. And this completely alters how you view certain daily decisions, because they cease to be merely right or wrong and begin to be evaluated by the sincere impact they have on your future freedom. This clarity doesn't solve everything at once, but it reorganizes the path. It removes the weight of personal injustice and sheds light on how the game really works. And when you understand that, the comparison loses its power, because the journey starts to make more sense. If this point gave you that feeling of, now I understand, comment below. That made sense to me, because this understanding opens the door to an even deeper level of conversation. There's a detail in this whole pattern that makes it even more dangerous. The cost doesn't appear immediately. It comes later, and it comes disguised. What seems safe, comfortable, and even responsible today often charges invisible interest down the line. Not bank interest, but interest on accumulated choices. And that's why so many people look at their current situation and feel that something doesn't fit, even without being able to pinpoint exactly when things started to get tight. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here a silent shift in consciousness occurs. Most decisions that shape your financial life don't generate immediate pain. On the contrary, they provide relief. They make things easier. They solve the immediate problem. The problem is that this momentary relief pushes the cost into the future. And when the future arrives, it doesn't warn you that it's demanding a specific decision. It only appears as tiredness, limitation, a feeling of being behind, difficulty in changing. You don't wake up one day and think, I'm paying for that choice from years ago. You just feel that the options have dwindled, that changing course seems too risky, that any adjustment requires an enormous effort. And this generates a distorted perception of the present, as if the problem were happening now, when in reality, it has been slowly building up behind the scenes of your routine. This is the point where many people feel trapped without understanding why. Because the pattern that seemed safe created a rigid structure. Everything works, but nothing moves. Financial life becomes a closed system, where each past decision limits the next. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to see alternatives. Not because they don't exist, but because the space to experiment with them has been consumed. The impact of this goes beyond money. It affects mindset. It affects how you perceive risk, change, and even opportunity. When the price of decisions arrives late, it usually comes in the form of fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of losing the little space that exists, fear of deviating from the norm and making everything worse. And so, the cycle reinforces itself. Safe decisions generate rigidity. Rigidity generates fear. Fear generates more defensive decisions. At some point, it all starts to click. You realize that you might be paying today for choices that seemed harmless years ago. And, at the same time, an unsettling unease begins to creep in. Are the decisions that seem normal now also creating future problems that I can't yet foresee? This question changes the game, because it shifts the focus from the present to the future trajectory. This is one of the most important revelations of this journey. Not to generate guilt, but to create awareness. Because only when you understand that the price comes later, does a different kind of curiosity begin to emerge. A desire to look at your own pattern more calmly, to question without despair, to seek transformation without having to turn your life upside down all at once. And it's precisely at this point that the conversation gets more interesting, because the question stops being, where did I go wrong? And becomes, how can I break this pattern without destroying what I've already built? If this reflection sparked something in you, comment below. I'm on this journey too, because recognizing this invisible delay is what prepares the ground for the next revelations. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation hasn't gone unnoticed. At some point, something made sense. It clicked. Maybe it even bothered you a little. And that's a good sign. It means you're not just trying to consume another video, but gaining a better understanding of what happens behind the scenes of your own decisions. If it makes sense to continue on this journey with me, subscribing to the channel is simply a way to keep this kind of reflection alive, to continue exploring these truths that almost no one talks about calmly and in depth. If you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," not as an obligation, but as a personal marker that you've reached the end and recognized yourself at some point along the way. These comments create a space for genuine exchange where those who go through similar situations realize they are not alone. And if this conversation has stayed with you this far, leaving a like is a simple gesture that helps this type of content continue to appear for those who are also trying to understand why they do everything right and still feel trapped. It's a silent way of saying, "This matters." There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into the idea of invisible decisions and their impact on the future. Click on it and continue reading.